Hamish de Bretton-Gordon is a retired UK Army colonel. He was a commanding officer of the UK and NATO chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to the program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
Ukrainian forces continue its advances deep inside Russia. They continue their offensive operation into the Kursk region. From your perspective, is the Kursk operation putting enough pressure on Russia and Vladimir Putin to bring the war in Ukraine closer to its end?
Well, yes, I hope so. This has been an incredibly impressive operation by the Ukraine forces. They have completely caught the Russians by surprise. And one of the greatest British generals, my favorite quote from him is, hit the enemy as quickly as you can, as hard as you can, where it hurts him most and when he's not expecting it. That was Field Marshal Slim. And that's exactly what the Ukrainian forces have managed to do here. And the fact that they've done it, they've obviously trained very, very hard in what we call combined arms maneuver. In other words, tanks and infantry, air defense and artillery working together with drones, masses of drones, and they've caught the Russians completely by surprise. And the fact that we are now 11 days into this counter maneuver by Ukraine forces and the Russians haven't managed to counterattack, to me as a soldier, is astonishing. It shows to me that actually the Russian army is completely stretched. Although there are hundreds of thousands of Russian troops in Ukraine, they are completely fixed. They appear to have no reserves. So I think this is a hugely impressive operation by the Ukrainian forces. There are now 200,000 Russian refugees heading east towards Moscow, who are telling everybody what is happening. Even in the news in Moscow now, people are recognizing that Ukraine has now taken Russian territory. And it has got, usually the war means little to the elites in Moscow, but now absolutely they brought it to the fore. So I absolutely hope, like everybody, that this puts Ukraine in a very strong position and the Russians in a very weak position. So hopefully, it is a big step forward to bringing this illegal invasion to a conclusion.
How do you see the best case scenario for Ukraine's offensive inside Russia?
Well, it depends how much the Ukrainian military want to go. Supplying these tanks and soldiers logistically with fuel and food and ammunition is going to be more difficult the further that they get into Russia. And of course, the Ukraine military will be very careful not to take too many forces away from elsewhere where perhaps the Russians could make gains. But I think it's unlikely. I think the Russian military is absolutely stretched. I think Putin has shown that the command structure of Russian forces is very poor. It's classic Russia, where all the major decisions are only made by Putin himself, and as such makes a very slow process. So I think that it's a very challenging position, happily, for the Russians now. And it's really up to Ukraine how much further it decides to push in. I expect they would not want to go too much further, but consolidate their position and then be in a very strong position to negotiate. And I know a lot of people in the West have been very concerned hitherto about the nuclear threat from the Russians. But, I've written about this extensively in the UK newspapers this week, that I think this is a threat we shouldn't concern ourselves with because, the Russians could have used nuclear weapons every day over the last 2.5 years. and they haven't, I think, because they can't. So it's important that Western leaders absolutely support Ukraine as much as they can, because I think everybody wants this war to end as quickly as possible, and on the terms that will satisfy the Ukraine government and the Ukraine people.
However, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin said that Russia would not negotiate with Ukraine after this offensive inside Russia. What is your take on these latest statements from the Kremlin?
Well, I think Putin is under pressure that he's never been in the last 20 or so years that he's been running Russia. The Russian people have been fed a diet of Putin being a brilliant military strategist. The last 11 days have shown that he is absolutely not that. He is vulnerable, and I think Putin is in a difficult position. You know, he is really speaking to the Russian people, not the world, because he knows that, you know, if the Russian people realize how incompetent he is, his time in power is very limited. So I think, you know, he might say they're not going to negotiate. He might not have a choice. When Prigozhin led the mutiny to Moscow, that very nearly upended Putin. I would say that the Kursk maneuver by Ukraine forces is even more important and significant than the Prigozhin mutiny of the Wagner forces. So I think Putin might be clinging on by his fingernails, which is why I reiterate again, it's essential that the West keeps up the pressure on Putin, keeps up its support to Ukraine, and the Ukraine forces keep doing what they've been doing for the last 11 days. I think I wouldn't quite go as far as to say that the Russian forces and Putin are on the run at the moment, but I think they are in a very challenging position for themselves. And quite frankly, they might not want to. They might say they're not going to negotiate. They might not have a choice pretty soon.
It also seems like Russian dictator Vladimir Putin was a little bit nervous during his meetings with the Russian commanders. How does he feel right now, from your perspective?
Well, I think he must feel pretty bad. We know that he's had a meeting with his commanders today, and some of his key commanders like Gerasimov are not there. So, you know, we know that he's got rid of a lot of those people, perhaps. And there are a lot of people in Moscow, a lot of the commentators in Moscow who are starting to question, you know, his leadership. And this would have been unheard of a few weeks ago. So I think, you know, to use a British saying, Putin is standing on very thin ice at the moment, and it's getting hotter in Moscow every day. I think, you know, he is clinging on, and we need in the West to hold our nerve, and hopefully the Ukraine forces will keep going, because, you know, it could well be that Putin is going to have to negotiate very soon, or he's going to go.
From your perspective, for how much territory for Russia Ukraine would need to seize, to capture, in order to have a big and bold bargaining chip for negotiations, from your perspective?
Well, that's almost an impossible question to answer. I think already what Ukraine has done so far would probably be enough. You know, this is Mother Russia, if you like. You know, nobody else has captured Russian territory, you know, since the Second World War, and you know, particularly Kursk, which is synonymous with the great tank battles in 1943. It's ingrained in the psyche of Russians. Nobody ever thought that a foreign country would be able to invade and take this hallowed ground for the Russians. But Ukraine has done that. And I think this is having a massive psychological impact across the whole of Russian society, who, you know, until very recently have been fully behind the Kremlin and fully behind Putin. So I don't think it's not a size. You know, somebody asked me today whether Ukraine was going to march on Moscow. I said I think that is highly unlikely and not required. This has had such a seismic impact on Moscow that actually it's such a brilliant move that what has been done so far, should be enough to bring Russian to the negotiation table. That would see all Ukrainian land being returned to Ukraine in response to Ukraine possibly returning Russian land that they have captured in the last few weeks.
Also, Russian authorities said that Ukraine tried to attack on other area. They tried to attack Belgorod region. If there is another offensive on the other area, for example, on the Belgorod region, what would it mean for the Russian side, and would it be a significant move of the Ukrainian army? Would it be the end for the Russian war effort?
Well, I think the Ukrainian High Command have been very canny and very clever in the way they've conducted this operation. They've given an awful lot for the Russian leader and commanders to think about. They've given them dilemmas. They don't know what's happening. They don't know where attacks are going to be. And absolutely, if Ukraine also attacked on another axis into Belgorod, that would further destabilize the Russian command and the Russian military. For the last few weeks and months, commentators like myself have been talking about potential Ukrainian attacks into Crimea. And it would appear that the Russians have bought that and they've strengthened Crimea to the expense of leaving areas like Kursk very lightly defended. And, the brilliant move that Ukraine military have done to attack into Kursk have completely unbalanced the Russian high command. So, an attack on another axis would further destabilize it. I'm sure that the commanders and the president in Kyiv are very concerned not to unbalance their own forces. There is so many Ukrainian tanks and infantry and drones. They don't want to leave other areas of the front line weakened where the Russians could make the most of it. Having said that, I believe that the Russian army is very stretched and probably incapable of making anything more than very sort of small localized attacks into Ukrainian positions. So I would be confident if I was running the Ukraine military operations to attack elsewhere as well. But we shall see. I think what has happened in Kursk in the last 11 days has really changed the situation massively, and hopefully will be enough to achieve the aims that the Ukraine government want to achieve.
Do you see this development as a turning point of this war?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. I think it's a very significant turning point. But it's absolutely essential that to keep the momentum up, that the Western backers of Ukraine keep supporting not only with ammunition and with equipment, but also verbally on the world stage. Putin needs to understand that he is completely trapped and there is no way out, and that there is no weakness in Europe, and Europe will keep supporting Ukraine, whatever happens. At the moment, Putin is on the back foot. He has been completely overrun by this event. And, I am sure Russia and Putin are looking for a way out. But I don't see a military one at the moment, because I think the Russian forces are so stretched. So it strikes me that if Putin wants to remain as president, he's going to have to negotiate with Kyiv sooner rather than later.
You said that if Putin wants to stay in power, he would negotiate. He must negotiate with Ukraine. Does it mean that it is impossible for Vladimir Putin to stay in power while the part of Russia's territory is occupied by Ukraine?
Well, I would certainly not want to, comment on something like that. That I don't know what's in Putin's head. I don't know what's in the heads of the high command in the Kremlin. But on the face of it, from all the talk that we've heard come out of the Kremlin in the last 2.5 years of this conflict and the 20 or so years of Putin's reign, he sees himself as a great Russian leader who would restore the old Soviet bloc. What in fact he's done is he's actually losing parts of Russia. So he is achieving absolutely 180 degrees opposite to what he said he's going to do for these last 20 or so years. So it is complete failure. I cannot believe that the Russian people would keep supporting somebody who has failed them so very badly. But that's up to them.
You mentioned about the Russian people, but it seems that there are not a lot of resistance from the Russian people against resistance to Ukraine's offensive inside Russia. We haven't seen such resistance of the civilians as we saw during the start of full-scale invasion of Russia by Ukraine. Why Russian people are not ready to defend its own country in the Kursk region? Why don't they want to defend Kursk region?
Well, I think there are a number of things here. I think first of all, the Russian people have been fed on a diet that Putin is this great military strategist. It is only now that they're actually realizing that that is not the case. They've been fed on propaganda and disinformation for all these years. And now that they are realizing it, the fact that the local Russians in Kursk seem to be welcoming the Ukrainian forces I think we're all a bit surprised. And no doubt in Moscow, that is having a profound effect. We've also seen 200,000 refugees leave the Kursk and Belgorod region heading east, and they're telling the story as well. So the Russian people are only just beginning to learn the truth of this whole ill-fated special military operation of Putin's. So I think they have been fed lies for the last 2.5 years. They're now getting the truth and realizing that actually what has been done, this illegal invasion of Ukraine, is not in their best interests. And hopefully they will make sure that they get a change of leadership, or at least persuade Putin that he needs to negotiate with Ukraine sooner rather than later.
Also, it seems like Russia's military leaders, commanders, and Vladimir Putin were caught off the guard by this surprise offensive inside Russia. From your perspective, why didn't they know about these plans? Did they underestimate Ukraine and Ukrainian army?
That is the great question that all of us who are military analysts and security analysts are looking at. How on earth did Russia not know that this was happening? I think there are a number of things. I think probably the arrogance of the Russian high command and the arrogance of Putin, the hubris, as we call it in the West, has really, prevented them seeing what is directly in front of them. I think also the Ukrainians have obviously, conducted this operation very well. The first principle of war, which has not changed for thousands of years, is surprise. If you can surprise your enemy, you're going to be halfway to defeating him. And this has completely surprised the Russians. Now, why they haven't, been able to pick up, absolutely, the Ukrainian forces must have trained for this for many, many months. And thousands of men and tanks would be relatively easy for Russian surveillance and satellites to pick up. But they've not done it. And they've been focused elsewhere. Basically, absolutely, they have been, completely caught out on this one and are completely off guard. a bit like a boxer, they have been hit very hard and, are in danger of being knocked out. I expect, maybe in a few years' time, we'll understand the full details of this and work out how Ukraine forces have managed to surprise the Russians so badly. But in these early days, I think it's just remarkable. And the Russians seem unable to sort the situation out. They seem unable to counterattack and do anything to stop the Ukrainian advance. And ultimately, I think it just shows what a shocking state the Russian leadership and high command are in, which is why I think your previous question, this is absolutely the key turning point in this war. And let's hope it leads to a Ukraine victory as soon as possible.
Bloomberg also reported about Russia's manpower issues. According to Bloomberg, there are some problems and issues in Russia regarding the conscription and getting enough manpower to continue a war of aggression against Ukraine. Also, Bloomberg reported that Russia could conduct another mobilization campaign until the end of this year. What are the chances for this development, and could this solve all Russia's problems on the ground?
No, I don't think it can. I think Russia has real issues. Most of the Russian soldiers on the front line are conscripts. They have very little training. Their morale is terrible. And, as a soldier who spent 30 years on the battlefields of the world, morale is absolutely key. You've really got to want to fight to fight. Fighting is a really unpleasant thing. And these young conscripts, as we saw in Kursk, have not fought. They've fallen back. Russia has emptied its jails of all its prisoners and convicts. They can't get any more there. Just by conscripting people, I think that is going to have an adverse effect. When they had a partial mobilization a couple of years ago, tens of thousands of Russian men fled the country, not wanting to fight. And I'm sure the same will happen again. But, if the Russians can't train them, which evidently they can't, then they are no more than cannon fodder. I think the Russian manpower issue is another issue that is completely restricting the Russian military, which is why this is such an important operation going at the moment, because it would take the Russians years to rebuild their army. And that is a very important point for NATO. There is no way that Russia is going to threaten NATO for many, many years. And that's why I personally think NATO should give Ukraine much more tanks and fighter jets, which at the moment some NATO leaders are worried that they're going to need to defend against Russia. They're not. Russia is not going to be a threat to NATO for many, many years.
What would it take for Ukraine to hold this gained territory inside the Kursk region? Would it be difficult for Ukraine to hold this territory for a while?
Well, I think it's quite possible. Ukraine can certainly, dig in with trenches, tank traps, and minefields. Certainly, it's really whether Ukraine thinks that it's worth it. So, I don't think there's any dispute that if Ukraine wants to hold that ground, it pretty much could. The fact that the Russians haven't been able to counterattack, which would be the obvious thing to do, and every battle that I can think of in history, you always have a plan to counterattack and you always have a reserve, and the Russians don't. So I think if Ukraine wants to hold that land, it certainly can do. Whether the Ukraine government thinks that it is worth the effort and the potential loss of life, that's entirely up to them. But I think they have made the statement, and that has rattled the windows in the Kremlin and around Russia really loudly. And hopefully over the next weeks and so it will allow Ukraine to achieve a peace that suits the people of Ukraine.
Don't you think that Russia still has some strategic reserves inside Russia which could be involved in repelling Ukraine's offensive inside Russia? What is your take on that, and is it a possible option for the Russian side if they do not want to move some troops from active war zone on the east of Ukraine to the Kursk region? Is it a real option for them? Do they have such possibility, such an option?
I don't think they do, actually. I don't think they do have this mobile reserve. You know, there are a few presidential guards looking after Putin. We know that he's moved air defense assets from the front line to protect his palaces in Moscow and in Sochi. I think Putin is probably more concerned about his own safety, and any spare troops that they have will probably be protecting, the Kremlin and Putin. So, I do not think they have a strategic reserve that they can deploy to Kursk or Belgorod or anywhere else. It doesn't exist. Their soldiers are all on the front line. Their tanks are pretty much all committed. There are talks about, getting tanks from the Second World War out of storage to be used. I mean, this is not the activities of an army that has a reserve that can plug the gaps. So I really don't. I think Russia is in a very, very challenging position, which is why I think it's a brilliant move by Ukraine, and hopefully will achieve the results that the president and the government and the people of Ukraine want.
It's interesting that Vladimir Putin has not declared a martial law or even full-scale mobilization inside Russia. Is he so afraid of his own people right now?
Yes, I think he is. I think if he does that, it absolutely reiterates failure, that Putin has failed. Let's go back to the early days of this illegal invasion. It was supposed to last 2 or 3 days. We're now well into the third year of the war. We understand over 600,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. And at the moment, there are 200,000 refugees from Kursk running east. It's an absolute disaster. So I think, Putin is probably trying to see how he can survive and how he's not disposed by the people. It's almost going back to when the Russian people got rid of the Tsars of Russia at the beginning of the last century. Putin sees himself as the great Tsar today. He might well meet the same end that the last Tsar did back in 1917.
Also, it seems like Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is so afraid of other actions, but from your perspective, how Western leaders understood that there are no any kind of red lines regarding Putin and Ukraine. He has not used nuclear weapons in response to Ukraine's offensive inside Russia. Do you feel that there could be a kind of a big shift in Western philosophy, in the Western perspective on all of these red lines and Putin's threats about escalation and nuclear weapons?
Yes, I hope so. I think it's very clear that Putin's red lines and his threats for nuclear weapons are complete bluff and bluster. Russian nuclear doctrine, in theory, allows him to use nuclear weapons if Russian territory is seized, which is obviously what's happening in Kursk. But he hasn't done that. And all his other red lines where he's threatened to use nuclear weapons have come and gone. So I am hoping that Western leaders are galvanized and realize this, that the red lines evaporate. And as such, those who have felt that they couldn't supply Ukraine with military hardware and help now realize that absolutely they can. And the quicker they do it and the more they do it is more likely to bring peace to Ukraine faster than anything else.
And my last point would be about the recent Politicos reporting about the US Security Assistance for Ukraine, Politico reported that the White House is open to provide Ukraine with long-range cruise missiles GASMA. This missile has a range for 320 kilometers. If there is a such decision from a White House, what would it mean for the both sides of the war? And do you think that Ukraine's offensive inside Russia has boosted this decision, and is the reason why the White House now is open to provide Ukraine with such long-range cruise missiles, which could be used with F-16 jets?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think now that the White House and Western leaders have realized that Putin's red lines don't exist. Hitherto, the Ukraine government have not been allowed to use, the long-range British Storm Shadow missiles and the US long-range missiles that we've spoken about. Yeah, if they were able to do those, I think again that would hurry peace, because Ukraine could then strike strategic targets deep into Russia, which would further denude the Russian forces. So, yeah, I think it would be a really positive step if the US government allowed this. And hopefully, if they do, the British government will allow the use of Storm Shadow, and also the French government will allow the use of their long-range missiles into Russia as well. And I think that, again, will hasten the end of this dreadful illegal invasion.
Do you mean that the United Kingdom is waiting for this decision from the White House?
Well, I hope that the United Kingdom would make the decision, on their own. But if the White House allows Ukraine, the Kiev government, to use these long-range missiles, then the UK has absolutely no reason not to do the same.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time, for advocating for more support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Glory to Ukraine.